There are days in a man's life that are meant to define him, shape the trajectory of his future, solidify everything he has ever hoped for. For me, that day was my wedding. The golden sun dipped into the ocean horizon, casting warm hues across the beachfront estate I had rented for the occasion. Julia was beautiful that day, no more than beautiful. She was radiant in a way that made my breath catch when I saw her walk down the aisle. Her dress glimmered faintly under the amber glow of the late afternoon sun, and I remember feeling as though time had paused. My hands had trembled slightly as I reached for hers, not out of fear, but out of awe. This woman, this elegant and poised creature, had chosen me. I stood tall, proud, and humbled. I thought I was the luckiest man in the world. Standing beside me was Ryan, my best friend since college. He was everything a best man should be, charismatic, responsible, always quick with a joke to ease the nerves. We had shared everything over the years, late-night talks about careers and dreams, long weekends away, even a tiny apartment when we were both broke and struggling in the early days. If I were to describe our bond, I would have said it was like having a brother I never had. The ceremony unfolded as planned. Guests teared up. Vows were exchanged. Rings were slipped onto fingers with shaky hands and full hearts. Applause erupted when we kissed. As the music swelled, I remember thinking that no version of heaven could possibly match this feeling. I held Julia's hand tightly, as if anchoring myself to the reality that this was indeed happening. The reception was a whirlwind of joy. Speeches, dancing, champagne, laughter echoing under the draped canopy lit with fairy lights. Ryan gave his toast, hilarious and heartfelt. He said things that made the room roar with laughter, followed by confessions that made many blink away tears. He said I was the most loyal person he had ever known. He said Julia was lucky. And then he locked eyes with her for a second longer than I thought necessary. It was fleeting, a glance, a twitch of a smile. It could have meant nothing. But in that moment, something uncomfortable lodged itself in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't reach. I brushed it aside. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe it was wedding day exhaustion, maybe it was nothing. But the signs didn't stop there. During the father-daughter dance, I caught Ryan sitting alone at the edge of the garden, typing furiously into his phone. Later, I noticed Julia had disappeared from the dance floor just after receiving a text. I found her a few minutes later near the water's edge, gazing out into the ocean. She said she just needed air. I believed her. I kissed her forehead and told her how happy I was. She smiled, but it felt off, hollow in a way I couldn't place. In the days that followed, the wedding faded into a warm memory sealed in photographs and thank you cards. Julia and I moved into our newly purchased home, a 3-bedroom cottage with large windows and ivy climbing up the exterior. It was meant to be our haven, our starting point. We hadn't taken a honeymoon yet, deciding to postpone until I completed a major contract with a new tech client. Life resumed in its slightly altered, newlywed rhythm. But I began to notice the subtle fractures. Julia's moods shifted unpredictably. Her phone became a constant companion, rarely left out in the open. I told myself it was just the stress of adjusting. That marriages take work and people need space. I gave her that space. I wanted to be the kind of husband who trusted, who believed in the strength of love without question. Then one afternoon, about 3 weeks into our marriage, she left her phone on the counter when she went upstairs to shower. It buzzed once, then again. I didn't plan to look. I swear I didn't. But the name that flashed on the screen wasn't disguised. It was Ryan. And the message preview wasn't just friendly. It was intimate, familiar, the kind of phrasing that pierced deeper than any blade could. A heaviness settled in my chest. 1,000 memories of the two of them flooded my mind like a fast-forward montage of betrayal. Late nights at the bar when I had to leave early, business trips I'd taken, moments when she laughed too hard at his jokes, the way her eyes sometimes followed him when she thought I wasn't looking. It all began to click. But I still didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more than suspicion. I needed the truth, not the version people tell you to make you feel better, but the raw, undiluted version that either sets you free or destroys you. So I began to observe, quietly, deliberately. I paid attention to every small inconsistency. I asked her casual questions and noted the hesitations. I tracked her mood after every call she claimed was from a work client. And I pretended to be the oblivious husband, the one she thought she had married. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon her hidden photo folder on her laptop. It was named something innocuous, Invoices 2021. But inside were screenshots of messages, images from nights I thought she was with her sister, and one single photo that shattered me completely. It was a mirror selfie, taken in a hotel room. She wore the same necklace I had given her on our engagement night. And Ryan stood behind her, shirtless, arms around her waist, kissing her neck. The timestamp was just 6 days before our wedding. I closed the laptop and sat there in the kitchen, numb. The kettle whistled in the background, a cruel reminder of life's normal rhythm still pulsing forward. My hands were steady, but everything inside me felt torn in two, grief and fury twisting into something I couldn't name. That night, as she laid beside me, asleep and unsuspecting, I stared at the ceiling and realized that I had married a stranger. Or perhaps the stranger was me, the man who had mistaken loyalty for blindness, who had loved so completely that he failed to see the cracks forming right beneath his feet. But I wasn't going to confront her in anger. No, that would give her control over the outcome. Instead, I would wait. I would gather what I needed. And when the time was right, I would let the truth speak louder than any accusation. Because some betrayals don't just hurt, they redefine who you are. And I was about to become someone I never thought I'd have to be. I wish I could say I was surprised. That the truth I uncovered blindsided me, shattered my trust in a single catastrophic moment. But in reality, the betrayal was a slow, crawling realization, like watching shadows move across a wall until they finally take shape. In the days that followed my discovery of the photo, I sank deeper into the unraveling of everything I had once believed. I began going through her devices when she was out, her laptop, her backup hard drive, even her cloud storage, which she hadn't bothered to log out of on our shared tablet. It felt wrong, invasive, but I justified it with the notion that I deserved to know the full extent of what had been taken from me. I wasn't looking for closure. I was preparing for war. What I found was worse than I imagined. Hundreds of messages between Julia and Ryan, saved over months, sometimes years. They had their own language, inside jokes, nicknames, a rhythm that told me this wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a living, breathing relationship that had grown beneath my feet while I stood on the surface, smiling like a fool. There were messages about me, detailed observations about my routines, my habits, even intimate descriptions of my insecurities. It was surreal, reading about myself as if I were a character in someone else's twisted narrative. Ryan had mocked my work ethic, my formality, the way I always tried too hard. Julia had laughed at how I talked in my sleep, how I nervously organized things when I was anxious. They had plotted meetings in hotels, some under the guise of Ryan helping Julia organize wedding details. I found receipts, hotel confirmations, rideshare logs, images, Julia in the same outfits she had worn home to me hours later. It was grotesque how perfectly everything fit together once I let myself look at it. But the part that destroyed me most wasn't the physical betrayal. It was the emotional intimacy. The way Julia had confided in Ryan about things she never told me, her fears about marriage, her doubts. The way she said she didn't think I would ever truly understand her, not like Ryan did. She spoke about me like I was a temporary holding pattern, someone to build a stable life with while her heart remained elsewhere. And Ryan, for his part, had no hesitation in feeding those doubts. He encouraged her, manipulated her, told her she deserved passion, deserved unpredictability, deserved him. He painted me as boring, safe, predictable, and she agreed. Over and over again, she agreed. I began to wonder if anything I'd experienced in the last 3 years had been real. Was our first kiss already stained with betrayal? Did she say yes to my proposal while planning her next night with him? Every memory became suspect. Every moment reevaluated through the lens of deceit. I had been living inside a lie, carefully curated and maintained by the two people I trusted most in the world. I didn't speak of it to anyone, not friends, not family. I couldn't bear the shame. I felt like a joke that everyone had been in on except me. Instead, I buried myself in work, pretending everything was normal while my mind played the messages on a loop like a cursed song I couldn't turn off. My appetite faded. My sleep became fragmented. I stared at the ceiling at 3 a.m., haunted by mental images that refused to fade. And through it all, Julia carried on as if nothing had changed. She cooked breakfast. She asked me how my meetings went. She kissed my cheek before she left for the gym. Every gesture was a performance, every smile a blade. I played along, perfecting the mask, waiting for the right moment to strike, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. I had to end this with control, with dignity. I refused to let them write the final chapter of my life without me holding the pen. I began collecting evidence. Screenshots of conversations, copies of hotel receipts, a log of locations. I even downloaded phone records from our shared carrier account. It wasn't just paranoia anymore, it was preparation. I had a lawyer on standby, recommended discreetly by a colleague who had gone through a brutal divorce. I told him everything. He listened, expression unreadable, and told me I had enough, but I wanted more. One evening, Julia told me she was going out for dinner with her old college friend, Natalie. I nodded, smiled, told her to enjoy it. As soon as the door closed behind her, I opened the location tracking app I had quietly installed 2 weeks prior. She wasn't at the restaurant she'd named. She was across town at a boutique hotel. Room 414, the same room I had seen in a photo weeks earlier. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. The truth was already in my possession, laid out like a confession. All that remained was the final act. But something inside me broke that night. Not the kind of break that makes you cry, but the kind that silences you, like a frozen lake cracking beneath your feet while you just stand there, unable to run. I sat in the living room for hours, staring at the wedding photo still framed on our mantel. I looked at the expressions on our faces, mine full of joy, hers unreadable now. I tried to remember how I felt that day. I couldn't. All I felt was distance. Julia came home late. Her hair smelled like a different perfume. Her smile was too easy. I pretended to be half asleep and let her slip into bed beside me. I lay still, staring into the dark, wondering how love could decay so quietly, so completely. The next morning, I made coffee. I packed my gym bag like usual. But this time, I slipped the flash drive into my pocket, the one holding everything I had compiled. I wasn't sure when I would use it. I just knew I needed to carry the truth with me, like armor. I began distancing myself. Emotionally, mentally. I stopped reaching out, stopped trying to please her. I watched how quickly she noticed. How she tried to reel me back in with affection, promises, carefully planned weekends. But the damage was done. I had already stepped outside the illusion. And once you've seen the wires behind the curtain, the magic never works again. I started therapy under a different name, told the therapist that I was dealing with anxiety from work. In truth, I needed someone to help me hold my mind together while the weight of betrayal threatened to pull me under. Week by week, I unpacked the layers, not just the infidelity, but the core wounds it opened in me. The fear of being unlovable, the anger at my own blindness, the deep ache of being replaced by someone I had once called brother. My therapist told me something I'll never forget. That grief over betrayal isn't just about losing someone, it's about losing the version of yourself who believed in them. That hit me hard, because I wasn't just mourning Julia. I was mourning the man I had been before I knew the truth. And that man, I realized, wasn't coming back. I no longer looked at Julia with love or hate. I looked at her the way you look at a museum exhibit, distant, analytical, detached. I began preparing my exit slowly, carefully. I updated financial documents, created backups, removed shared passwords, transferred files. I constructed a fortress of silence, brick by digital brick, until I was ready. Because when I confronted her, I didn't want to scream. I didn't want to beg. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace, and the only way to get that was to be 3 steps ahead, to be unshakable. I knew the confrontation was coming. I could feel it building like a storm behind the horizon, but I would decide when it broke, on my terms, with the strength of someone who had been shattered but chose to rise. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't revenge, it's survival. I had rehearsed the moment 1,000 times in my mind. There were versions where I exploded, yelled, tore everything apart. There were quieter versions where I simply handed her the proof and walked out. But when the day finally came, none of those imagined scenes felt adequate. Because when betrayal has lived beside you long enough, it doesn't ignite like gasoline, it corrodes slowly until everything is hollow. The confrontation didn't happen during some orchestrated event. There were no candles, no dramatic rain, no public stage. It was an ordinary Wednesday. I had just returned from work early, feigning a headache. Julia was home in the kitchen, humming to herself while preparing dinner. I stood at the doorway, watching her for a long moment. She was smiling, not at me, just to herself. A quiet, contented kind of smile. I wondered if she had just texted Ryan. In my pocket was a printed envelope containing copies of the messages, photos, call logs, and hotel records. I had spent weeks preparing it, organizing it in a way that left no room for doubt or denial. It was a surgical strike, neat, clean, irrefutable. I walked past her without saying anything, placed the envelope on the dining table, and walked upstairs. My hands were steady, my breath even, but inside me something cold had taken root. I didn't wait to see her reaction. Upstairs, I sat in my office and waited. I didn't hear anything at first, just the normal sounds, the clink of utensils, the low hum of the refrigerator. Then the creak of her footsteps approaching the table. Then silence, a long, heavy silence. I imagined her opening the envelope, leafing through the contents, her eyes scanning every word, every timestamp, every image that spelled out her betrayal with mathematical precision. I wondered if she would gasp, cry, run, apologize. A few minutes later, I heard her footsteps retreating, then the soft click of the bedroom door closing. No confrontation, no excuses, just the quiet collapse of a house of lies. I stayed in my office until nightfall. Eventually, I heard the sound of her packing. Drawers opened and closed. Hangers slid across rods, zippers, shuffling. At some point, I went downstairs and saw the envelope still on the table, its contents spilled out in disorder. By morning, she was gone. That should have been the end of it, a clean cut. A neat exit, but betrayal never walks alone. It brings with it shadows, echoes, complications that linger long after the people have left. A few days later, I received a call from Ryan. I didn't answer. Then came the emails, first cautious, then defensive, then angry. He said I had misunderstood. He blamed Julia. He tried to position himself as a victim of her manipulation, but I knew better. I had read his words, seen the photos. Ryan wasn't just a man who had betrayed his best friend. He was a man who had calculated it, hidden it, and justified it to himself with cowardly ease. He hadn't just taken what wasn't his, he had stood beside me at my wedding and smiled while doing it. That kind of duplicity doesn't deserve a response. It deserves silence. But even as I distanced myself from both of them, the fallout seeped into my life like water through cracked stone. Friends began asking questions. Some had suspected. Others were shocked. A few confessed they had seen something between them but didn't want to interfere. That hurt more than I expected. To know that people I trusted had seen the edges fray and said nothing. But I didn't blame them. People avoid discomfort like a plague, even if it means letting someone walk blindly into disaster. The worst of it, however, came not from the personal sphere, but the professional one. Ryan and I had once talked about launching a venture together. In the months before the wedding, I had shared business plans, client strategies, future proposals, everything. And now I discovered he was using them. I received word from a former associate that Ryan had quietly started a firm with an eerily similar structure, targeting the same clients we had discussed. That realization hit harder than the affair. Love, after all, is unpredictable. People fall in and out. But loyalty in business, that's supposed to be transactional, professional, governed by rules. He had broken them all. I was no longer just a betrayed husband. I was now a man whose legacy was being hijacked. I gathered the documentation, emails, drafts, proof of our earlier collaboration. I forwarded everything to my lawyer. Legal action would take time, but I was patient. The wheels of justice might turn slowly, but they turn. And this time, I wasn't seeking emotional closure. I was seeking accountability. If he had thought he could walk away with my blueprints, he was mistaken. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding. Emotionally, I was still broken in places I couldn't articulate. The mornings were the hardest. Waking up alone in a house that once echoed with laughter, now heavy with silence. But over time, the grief dulled into something manageable. I filled the spaces with routine, early runs, longer hours at work, evenings spent reading instead of watching the clock. I avoided social media. I knew Julia had moved in with Ryan. Friends told me, some even sent screenshots, but I never looked. I didn't want to see their curated happiness, the digital parade of forced smiles and tropical vacations. I knew better. What begins in betrayal rarely ends in bliss, and even if it did, I didn't want it, not anymore. Strangely, I began to appreciate the clarity. The storm had passed, and though it had destroyed much, it had also cleared the field. I could see again. I could rebuild without illusion, and for the first time in years, I no longer felt the need to explain myself to anyone. I didn't have to keep up appearances. I didn't have to play the perfect husband or the accommodating friend. I was just me, flawed, wounded, but awake. One night, I revisited the wedding album, not to relive it, but to reclaim it. I flipped through the pages slowly, studying each face, each pose, each carefully staged moment. And then I reached the photo, the one where Ryan had his hand on my shoulder, both of us laughing, Julia in the background watching us with an unreadable expression. I stared at it for a long time. Then I pulled it from the sleeve, walked outside, and lit a match. As the flames consumed the paper, curling the edges and blackening the smiles, I felt something inside me shift. Not anger, not sadness, just release. I didn't need reminders. I didn't need artifacts of a life that no longer existed. I was done mourning what was lost. I was ready to start looking for what could be found. That night I slept without dreams. After the dust had settled and Julia was gone, I thought the worst was behind me. I believed I had uncovered the core of the betrayal, the infidelity, the deception, the loss of two people I once held close. But I was wrong. What I had seen was only the surface. What lay beneath it, hidden in legal documents, server logs, corporate records, was something far colder, more calculated, less emotional, and far more dangerous. It started with a strange email from a longtime client. A friendly note thanking me for the proposal I had apparently sent just a few days earlier and saying they would think about it. The problem was I hadn't sent them anything. I hadn't even been in contact with them for months. Confused, I asked my assistant to check our proposal tracker. Nothing there. No recent outreach. No scheduled pitch. Something didn't sit right. I followed up with the client under the pretense of clarifying a small detail in the supposed proposal. They forwarded me the email chain. My heart sank as I read the contents. It was my pitch word for word, paragraph by paragraph, from a deck I had written a year ago when Ryan and I were still discussing launching a company together. But this version had his branding, his new firm's logo, his name in the signature. I stared at the screen in disbelief, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest, like betrayal had reached out and twisted its hand once again. This wasn't just about love anymore. This was theft. This was violation of intellectual property. This was him taking the last piece of what we built together and stamping his name on it. Fueled by a sickened kind of curiosity, I began digging. Not just emails, but archived drafts, shared drives we used to work on collaboratively, old Slack threads, project outlines. What I found was nauseating. Ryan had been quietly copying documents from our shared folders long before the wedding. Marketing strategies, budget projections, pricing models. He hadn't just stolen my wife. He had stolen my ideas, my language, my vision, and passed it off as his own. He had weaponized every moment of trust, every Dropbox link, every shared PDF. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. This was betrayal wrapped in ambition, soaked in opportunism, and executed with surgical cruelty. I compiled everything. I built a timeline, file by file, correspondence by correspondence. I met with my lawyer, slid the thick folder across the desk, and watched his brows rise with each page he turned. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. The proof was overwhelming. What had started as a messy personal scandal had now evolved into a full-scale corporate theft case. The legal team moved quickly. Cease and desist letters, temporary injunctions, warnings about pending litigation. Ryan responded through a lawyer of his own, someone far less polished than I expected. Their response was defensive, erratic, and clearly nervous. It was the first time I realized that Ryan, beneath all the arrogance and charm, was scared. He hadn't expected me to retaliate. He had counted on me collapsing. And for a while maybe I had, but not anymore. I found myself studying him from afar, tracking the public face of his new business. Social media posts, press releases, interviews where he spoke confidently about the foundational philosophies behind his company, quoting lines I had written in a white paper 2 years ago. Watching him speak was like watching a stranger wearing my skin. He had absorbed so much of my work that even I couldn't tell where my voice ended and his imitation began. But imitation has limits. Eventually, he hit a wall. Clients started noticing inconsistencies, promises that weren't fulfilled, strategies that didn't adapt well because they were built on someone else's understanding. That someone else was me. And no matter how much Ryan copied, he couldn't reproduce the depth that had come from experience, from failure, from learning, from building something from scratch instead of from betrayal. The real blow came when one of our largest mutual clients, after a few disappointing months with Ryan's firm, reached out to me directly. They said they missed the clarity I brought. The integrity. They didn't mention Julia. They didn't need to. The subtext was clear. They had placed their faith in the wrong man. I agreed to meet. That meeting led to a contract. That contract led to others. Slowly, methodically, my name returned to the field not as a victim, but as a competitor. But the most difficult part of all of this wasn't rebuilding my reputation. It was dealing with the question that gnawed at me late at night. Why? Why had Ryan done this? Why had Julia gone along with it? Were they truly in love? Or had it all been one long manipulation, born from envy, ego, and an unwillingness to walk their own path? I would never get answers to those questions. Not real ones. But part of healing, I realized, meant accepting that closure isn't always packaged in explanations. Sometimes closure is just the ability to move forward without needing to understand the wreckage you leave behind. I began therapy again, this time not out of desperation, but out of commitment to something deeper. I wanted to rebuild not just my business, but myself, to understand why I hadn't seen it coming, why I had ignored the signs, why I had trusted so deeply that I never questioned the intentions of those closest to me. Therapy revealed truths I hadn't been prepared for, about my fear of confrontation, about how I had prioritized harmony over honesty, about how my desire to be the good guy had made me vulnerable to people who didn't play by the same rules. These realizations weren't comfortable, but they were necessary because I didn't want to become cynical. I didn't want to build walls so high that no one could ever reach me again. And as I focused on healing, something unexpected happened. The pain began to lose its sharpness, the flashbacks faded, I stopped checking their social media, I stopped thinking about what-ifs. The betrayal no longer defined me, it was simply something that had happened, a chapter, a scar, a memory that no longer demanded my full attention. I started dating again, carefully. At first it felt strange, laughing with someone new, sharing stories without the weight of comparison. But slowly it became natural. One dinner turned into several. One weekend trip turned into something more. And through it all, I kept waiting for the ghost of Julia or the shadow of Ryan to reappear in my mind to interrupt the joy with doubt. But they didn't, not anymore. There was power in knowing I had survived. Not just the heartbreak, but the humiliation, the professional sabotage, the loss of trust. I had survived, and not only that, I had rebuilt, smarter, stronger, clearer. I no longer fantasized about revenge. I didn't need Ryan to fail publicly. I didn't need Julia to come crawling back. Their consequences were already playing out, whether I witnessed them or not. What mattered was that I had chosen to live differently, to move forward with integrity, to protect my peace, to write the next chapters of my life without their fingerprints on the page. Sometimes I pass by the old beach where I got married, not intentionally, just during walks or business trips. The venue is still there, still beautiful, still used for celebrations. But when I look at it now, I don't feel pain, I don't feel rage, I feel distance. The kind of emotional distance that says, I was there, but I'm not anymore. That is healing. Some people believe that recovery is like climbing out of a pit, a single upward motion from darkness into light. But what I learned was that healing doesn't rise in a straight line. It spirals. Some days you feel weightless, as if the past is far behind you. Other days you find yourself right back at the bottom, staring into the same void you thought you had escaped. In the weeks that followed my legal confrontation with Ryan, I found myself learning how to live again. Not merely to exist or endure, but to wake up each day and consciously decide not to let the past govern my steps. That was harder than I expected. Forgiveness, at least the kind that people romanticize, wasn't something I could conjure. What I could do, however, was release myself from needing revenge. Revenge is a heavy thing. It disguises itself as justice, but always ends up anchoring you to the pain. I had done what I needed to do legally, professionally. Ryan's operation had taken a major hit. Several clients had pulled out after learning of the lawsuit. His reputation, once polished and charming, had started to gather cracks, and while he didn't fall immediately, the descent had clearly begun. But I didn't celebrate it. I didn't track his decline like a hunter following blood. I poured myself into my own business. Every ounce of grief was channeled into productivity. I rebuilt my team. I restructured our client pipeline. I updated our brand. I made phone calls to clients I hadn't spoken to in years. Slowly, business began to flourish again. And this time, it wasn't built on a fragile trust. It was built with fire-hardened certainty. What surprised me most was how much clarity I gained from the loss. With Julia and Ryan gone, I could see myself more clearly, without distortion, without the need to filter my worth through someone else's validation. For years, I had worked hard not only to succeed, but to be seen as enough for my partner, for my best friend, for everyone. But that desire to be enough had blurred the edges of who I was. Now, stripped of that, I was sharper, more defined. I started running more regularly. At first, it was just a way to silence the noise in my head, to exhaust myself into sleep. But it became something else. A rhythm, a meditation, each step a declaration that I was still here, still moving. The body heals when the mind gives it purpose, and mine had found one. One morning, during a jog through the park, I paused at the edge of a lake. The sun had just risen, casting a bronze sheen across the still water. A few ducks glided across the surface. Children played in the distance, and for the first time in what felt like years, I felt still, not frozen, still, balanced. I sat on a bench, sweat cooling on my back, and realized I no longer felt the urge to carry my pain like armor. I didn't need it anymore. That realization didn't come with tears or some dramatic swell of music. It was quiet, gentle, like a door opening to a room I hadn't known was locked. I began reaching out again, not to Julia or Ryan, but to people I had kept at a distance. Friends who had asked if I was okay but never pushed. Colleagues who had offered help I never accepted. I invited them to lunch. I said yes to coffee. I listened when they spoke. And slowly the web of my life began to weave itself back together, not perfectly, not as before, but authentically. There was one friend in particular, Claire, whom I had known for years. She had been part of our larger circle, more connected to my sister than to me, but always kind, always steady. She had been there during the wedding, seated quietly near the back. After everything fell apart, she sent a short message, not prying, just offering a hand if I ever needed it. I hadn't responded then, but now, months later, I did. We met at a quiet cafe. I hadn't expected anything more than polite conversation. But there was something about the way she listened, not out of pity, but out of respect, that struck me. We spoke not about the past, but about books, travel, music, and when we did speak of what happened, there was no awkwardness, just space. Space for honesty without the pressure of performance. That coffee turned into another, and another. It didn't feel like a rebound or a distraction. It felt like re-entering the world slowly with someone who didn't ask for more than presence. She didn't try to fix me. She simply showed up. Still, I was careful, wary. My wounds hadn't disappeared, they had simply closed. Scars don't ache unless you press them, but they remain. I made sure she understood that I wasn't rushing toward anything, and she made sure I knew she wasn't expecting anything I couldn't give. Over time, we built something gentle, not explosive or dramatic, just kind. It was in the way she left a note after dinner or how she remembered how I took my coffee. It was healing in the shape of a person. And that's when I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't in watching someone fall. It was in rising, quietly, steadily, without bitterness, without announcements, just living better than before. One evening, nearly a year after Julia walked out of our house for the last time, I found myself sitting in that same dining room. The table was set with 2 plates, candles flickered, and music played softly in the background. Claire was laughing at something I said, her hand resting lightly on mine. And I looked around and thought, this is what freedom feels like. Not dramatic escapes or angry monologues, but this, peace. The ghost of my past still visits sometimes. There are moments, stray memories, familiar places that bring it back, but they no longer hurt, they echo, and then they fade. I never got closure from Julia. She never reached out again, never apologized beyond that pathetic note she left behind. Ryan, too, faded from view. His business never fully recovered. Last I heard, he had moved to another city, trying to rebuild under a new name. I don't hate him, I don't pity him, I just don't think of him much anymore. Because my story is no longer about them. It's about me. And in that I found everything I thought I had lost. Time has a strange way of softening pain but sharpening memory. The events that once brought me to my knees no longer have the power to break me. Yet I remember them in crystalline detail, the expressions, the moments, the silences. Not because I want to relive the past, but because I need to remember how far I've come. A year and a half had passed since I confronted the truth, since Julia walked out of my life, and since Ryan's ambition crumbled under the weight of his deception. The life I live now is nothing like the one I had before, and that is a blessing I didn't see coming. My days are full, not just with work, but with purpose. I wake up early without dread, I eat breakfast slowly, I return messages from old friends. I run, I read, I rest. Claire and I have found a rhythm, nothing rushed, nothing forced. It's not about replacing the past, it's about building something that respects the present. We've traveled together. We've sat in silence without the need to fill it. We've learned how to be kind to each other in the way only 2 people who know loss can be. There's no need for performance, no expectation of perfection, only presence. I thought the story of Julia and Ryan had closed. I thought their chapter in my life had ended, filed away into a drawer-marked lesson learned. But life, as it often does, had one final twist in store. It happened during a corporate symposium I was invited to speak at. A 3-day retreat for executives and entrepreneurs held in a mountain resort, a mix of workshops, panels, and networking. I almost declined the invitation, but something in me wanted to go, not for exposure, not for opportunity, just to see how it felt to stand in front of strangers and share my journey, not the one of heartbreak, but the one of reinvention. The second morning after my keynote, I was approached by several attendees. We talked strategy, resilience, ethics, and leadership. I felt confident, grounded. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. Julia. She was standing near the buffet table, holding a small glass of orange juice, speaking with someone I vaguely recognized from our previous social circles. Her hair was shorter, her posture more rigid. There was a weariness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She hadn't noticed me yet, but I felt the air shift the moment our presence overlapped in the same room. I didn't approach her. I didn't need to. I had no intention of revisiting a closed door, but fate has a way of testing resolve, and an hour later she found me. I was alone, seated on a bench near a path overlooking the tree-covered slopes. The air was crisp, the silence calming, and then came the shadow in my peripheral vision, followed by the quiet weight of her presence beside me. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I didn't look at her. I simply kept my gaze on the mountains. After a few minutes, she stood and walked away. That was it. That was the moment I knew she regretted everything. Not because of what she said nothing, but because she came, because she sat beside me knowing I would not speak to her. Because silence sometimes is louder than screaming. Her silence was not peace, it was shame. Later that day, I learned Ryan had accompanied her to the event. Not as a speaker, not as a partner, but as an attendee trying to rebuild his footing. They hadn't come together in the emotional sense. Word around the conference was that their relationship had fallen apart within months. People whispered about the lawsuit, about the clients he lost, about the scandal. Some knew my name, some didn't, but they knew the story, the betrayal, the consequences. I passed him in the hallway that evening. He glanced up, saw me, and immediately looked away. There was no smugness left in his face, no swagger, only discomfort. He didn't try to speak, he didn't extend a hand. He kept walking, and I kept walking. It felt like justice, not the dramatic kind you read in books or see in courtrooms, but the quiet, patient kind that life sometimes delivers when you've done the hard work of healing. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need acknowledgement, just that look, that hesitation, that silence. That night I stood on the balcony of my suite, glass of wine in hand, watching the moonlight reflect off the slopes. The world was quiet. Claire texted me to ask how my speech went. I smiled at the message, replied, and then turned my phone off. I let the quiet settle into my bones. I thought back to who I was the day I got married. A man in love, naive, full of faith. I mourned him once. But tonight I honored him because he didn't die. He evolved. He broke and then rebuilt. And now he stood here, not bitter, not hollow, but whole. Sometimes I wonder what Julia thinks when she sees me now. If she imagines what life would have looked like had she chosen differently. But I don't dwell on it, because I no longer live in the echoes of what-ifs. I live in the presence of what is. The next morning I left the conference early. Not to escape, but because I had nothing left to prove. I had spoken my truth. I had faced my past. I had seen in flesh and blood the people who once held so much power over my happiness, and they no longer did. As I drove down the winding roads away from the resort, trees rushing past in golden blur, I felt light. Not triumphant, not vengeful, just free. They had laughed once behind my back, mocked me, lied to me, betrayed me. But now they carried the weight of their choices. I, on the other hand, had let mine go. I don't know where they are now. I don't check. I don't ask. Their names rarely cross my lips, even in memory. They are simply part of the landscape that shaped me, like storms that tear through and leave behind clearer skies. What remains is peace. What remains is truth. What remains is me. And I'm still standing.